Out of the Fiery Furnace is brought to you by a company that makes aluminum for transportation, construction, and manufacturers of consumer products all around your house. Commonwealth Aluminum.
These are the ghosts and shadows of a once great industry. They're the ruins of the old engine houses, which stand sentinel above the abandoned tin and copper mines of Cornwall. This was the mining center of the world at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and the deep mines and the granite beneath helped to sustain it and carry it forward. But the skills and innovations of that creative minority, the British, who led the Industrial Revolution, brought into existence rivals to Britain's ascendancy, which in time began to dwarf her. At the very moment in 1851, when the British were celebrating the Great Exhibition, which marked the zenith of Britain's long preeminence as the world's first industrial power, huge new deposits of copper were found in other parts of the world, notably around Lake Superior in the United States. The price of copper plummeted. The Cornish mining industry fell with it, never to rise again. But the traditions were not lost. The Cornish miners, in their thousands, left here and moved out all over the world. They took with them their unrivaled skills in hard rock mining, which they had used over generations to unlock the copper and tin from the granite formations in these ancient cliffs and moors. They took them to Johannesburg, to South Australia, to Pennsylvania, and there they transplanted them in the New World. By the time Liberty was placed at the entrance to New York Harbor in 1886, to give her welcome to the tired and poor of the Old World, the Americans had already surpassed the Europeans in the application of science and technology. The statue itself might be, as it was, made in France, but henceforth the old nations of Europe would only accompany the Americans into the age of machines. The New World was about to redefine the life of the common man. The old ironworks at Saugus were set down here in the Bible Commonwealth of Massachusetts at just about the time the American wilderness was first being found successfully. And like many of the place names imported with it along this river, names like Hammersmith and Bristol and Braintree, it was a transplant, a copy from England. The Saugus ironworks were the first to be established on the American continent. And they marked not just the introduction of the Industrial Revolution to America, but a new departure. For the Americans would proceed to do with the Industrial Revolution over the next 200 years, essentially what they did with all the citizens from all the nations who flocked here as immigrants. They naturalized it, and they made of it something specifically American. Saugus was the working prototype, the forerunner of that immense, phenomenal progress in productive industry, which has been unmatched so far in history and which provided the framework for the American civilization and was the source of its dynamic energies. Why America should have been such a success, and why it was that the Americans became so strangely restless in the middle of so much plenty and abundance, has received a fascinated and more or less constant attention. There were, of course, the two great determinants of space. Here a man could feel free to breathe and to move, and there were vast resources. But the American civilization, while it reflected continuity, was also a fresh start. In the age of the common man, to which they largely gave rise, the Americans had in common their individualistic democracy. Where there was no inherited wealth, everybody worked. It was not held to be degrading or humiliating. To work for profit was held in honor, and all the prejudices were for it and not against it. The whole American population became involved in productive industry. And in the words of one great historian who painted this portrait of them, they all devoted themselves to it, all of the time. That is what set the Americans apart. They very largely came from a background in Europe of past denials and constraints. They were competent and full of new desires. And they set out on a revolutionary quest for the good things in life, to win and to share them. A search for physical gratification which became with them a universal passion. The American way of doing things has largely determined the material world in which we live. The Saugus Ironworks started in 1646. It didn't operate for very long, but in its time it graduated the first generation of American ironmasters. These men went back to all the other colonies and set up furnaces and foundries. Soon the American colonists were in a position to produce the cannons and shot, eventually fired by George Washington's armies in the War of Independence. The first ironworks, like Saugus, were set up in response to the urgent need of the colonists for simple necessities, like nails, hoes, axes, and plows. They had had to be imported from Europe, and were usually hard to get. There were local mineral deposits, but they were not adequate for either needs or ambitions in the colonies. A search for resources turned eyes towards the unknown West. In the early 1800s, explorers and Jesuit missionaries pushing west into the wilderness began to bring back accounts of extraordinary opportunities lying in wait along the shores of the Great Lakes in what is now Michigan. The rumors became reality when Douglas Houghton, a geologist, went ashore on the Keweenaw Peninsula and found copper literally lying about. His report in 1841 drew a rush of fortune seekers to the shores of Lake Superior. When the first American prospectors came here to what was then the remote, and which is still this rather off-the-beaten-track peninsula on Lake Superior, they found that they were not the first, and that others had mined here thousands of years before them. It confirmed rumors and reports which had reached the early American settlements in the East and which had persisted for more than a century. This trench is part of the copper culture of the American Aborigines, the American Indians, which grew up around the Great Lakes and which modern archaeology and carbon dating suggests is at least 4,000 years old. This was the earliest form of mining in North America. Those very early Indians had mined for salt in typical underground tunnels. They had quarried for flint, and they dug for copper in thousands of open pits and trenches like this one, some of them 15 to 20 feet deep. And they used stone hammers to which a handle was attached by the groove, like this one found near here. There's no evidence to suggest that the American Indians knew anything about smelting processes. The techniques of using blast in furnaces to raise the temperature sufficiently for a more advanced technology like iron had to await the coming to the North American continent of the Europeans. But the archaeologists have found in these pits enough evidence to show that the Indians possessed a whole culture in copper. The Indian metalsmiths were able to take advantage here of a freak of geological history, which deposited copper on this peninsula around Lake Superior in veins of almost pure copper metal. Here is a piece. It had welled up in the fissures between the rock with the streams of lava. And we must imagine the Indians lighting fires to heat the rock, to expand it, then quenching it quickly with water from the lake to reveal the veins of copper. Because it's fairly certain that they didn't know anything about smelting, it's probable that they simply hammered the copper nuggets when they made their various artifacts. Here's a knife found in one of the pits, and copper arrowheads. The arrival of American prospectors on the Keweenaw Peninsula around Lake Superior in the early part of the last century coincided with the growing acceptance of the insights of a new science, geology. And it was the copper culture of the American Indians which pointed the way to a mineral treasure of more extensive deposits which had been waiting here for thousands of years. The first significant find was made in 1843. A party of men, following a line of Indian pits, dug into the rock slope along a vein of copper. The Cliff Mine marked the beginning of the first great mining boom in America's history. And soon, with the need to get deeper into the hard rock, the ubiquitous Cornish miners arrived, leaving their own mines derelict behind them. And here, in a new abundance of copper, they dug out the beginning of the vast American mining industry. The great mines of the Lake Copper period, derelict now in their turn, the Cliff, the Central, Quincy, Calumet, and Hecla, produced billions of pounds of copper and paid hundreds of millions in dividends. The success around the Great Lakes established a fundamental compulsion of American life, the movement to the open West. American history has little to show in either age or mystery. It spans, after all, only 400 years. But in that time, the Americans have gone from their log cabins to become a world power, and from the first primitive settlements in the wilderness to walk on the moon. Of all the impulses which get singled out as an explanation of that tremendous American exuberance and vitality, the one which has had the accolade has been the frontier. To go with the yeast of an individual, egalitarian democracy was the ferment of that advancing line in a wild continent of grand proportions, the constantly moving frontier, of which this place, Fort Wilkins in Upper Michigan, is an authentic relic. The existence of so much free space, and within it the lavish distribution of huge, untouched natural resources, which the fort was designed in part to protect, meant a kind of perennial rebirth of energies which must otherwise have flagged. Unlike the Spanish in the Americans were less concerned to conquer nations, although for the Indians that was the corollary of their arrival. They came to conquer nature and master its resources, not to ransack the world on behalf of some distant king. By the time we come to the rise of the American civilization, the obsession and preoccupation with precious metals like gold was largely diminishing. Industrial development had begun to govern both wealth and power, and in America it quickly came to constitute the crucial objective. Democracy itself was favorable to the growth of manufactures because it increased without limit the manufacturing classes. And democracy diverted attention from agriculture. While cultivation of the ground promised a sure and certain return here, it was also a slow one, and it called for patience. The early colonial record in America makes clear that in the sentimental and idealized portrait we have of the frontier, there is something which gets overlooked. Its presentation as an agricultural paradise, inhabited by a God-fearing people, obeying a scriptural injunction, that God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden, not to be idle, but to dress it and keep it, does not include the fact that from the very beginning, the American settlers were determined to prosecute vigorously the search for minerals, as well as to fish, farm, and cut wood. It was the enormous deposits of iron ore found near here which created the framework for the unparalleled growth of American industry, as everywhere the cry went up for machines. This vast hole in the ground is a measure of the tremendous growth of the American steel industry towards the end of the 19th century. These iron hills made the United States a great military power. This was only one of the open-cut mines around Lake Superior which dug out the largest iron deposits that had ever been discovered. The first ores taken out of Mesabi were so rich, some were more than 60% iron, that they could be tipped straight into the blast furnaces. These days, the ore is a lower quality. It has to be ground up in huge mills. The iron dust is extracted magnetically. It's made into pellets. Pellets are the ammunition for the steel plants. An almost overwhelming problem stood in the way of easy development of Lake Superior iron. There was no passage to the sea. The difference in level between the Great Lakes was in places insurmountably spectacular. The Sault-Ste-Marie Canal, begun in 1853, outflanked the rapids, which blocked the exit from Lake Superior. It's an American Suez. Its contribution to the world economy qualifies it as one of the more significant artificial waterways ever built. The canal and its locks uncorked the lakes. Billions of tons of iron ore were brought within reach of the energy stored in America's gigantic eastern coal fields. These two great resources were harnessed to create the industrial heartland of the United States and its capital, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Whereas colonial America had adopted European iron-making technology virtually without change, the United States bent the production of steel to its own will and did so on an overwhelming scale. Of the myriad products of America's growing steel technology in the late 19th century, none has had a more striking effect on the profile of the world's cities than the skyscraper. The steel-framed tower building is the most emphatic American statement in architecture. The skyscraper was born in Chicago in the aftermath of the Great Fire there of 1871. Among the young aspiring architects who seized the opportunity presented was William Jenney. Jenney's building for the Home Insurance Company, completed in 1885, was the first tall office block to incorporate the principle of a steel skeleton, which took all the structural loads off the walls. It worked so well that an additional 2 stories were added later. Freed from their load-bearing function, the outer walls of skyscrapers have become mere blinds and curtains. Skyscrapers dwarf the individual, which is why some consider them soulless ant heaps. But the pressure of rising populations upon available space has assured their success. In the opening up of the American continent, there was no stimulus more powerful than the sight and sound of the iron horses rushing west. America seized the possibilities demonstrated in England by the railways with an instant and characteristic enthusiasm. Karl Marx called the railway builders the light cavalry of capitalism. In the United States, they were given their head. Within 4 years of the opening of the world's first passenger railway in 1825 between Stockton and Darlington, the Americans had shipped an English locomotive across the Atlantic. 2 years later, they had their own engines pulling trains in regular service. By 1850, the American railways were 4 times longer than the British. The natural climax was the great race to close the last gap between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. They agreed to meet at Promontory Point in a windy valley north of Salt Lake City in Utah. The Central Pacific track layers got there first. In the final frenzied stages, they won a $10,000 bet with their rivals that they could lay 10 miles of track in a single 12-hour day. America was hardly recovered from the bitterness of the Civil War when the historic link-up took place on May the 10th, 1869. Much was made of the driving of the final spike as a symbol of a union re-found and a new point of departure. But the wonder of the age, the railways, and the reign of coal and steam was already measured. The first settlers in northern Pennsylvania had seen these iridescent bubbles rising in the creeks. It was known as rock oil, and at first they used it only as a patent medicine. By 1850, they found they could distill it. It made a better light than the whale oil and the candles that the settlers were using. And it was, of course, petroleum. Oil had revealed its presence from the earliest antiquity. People had been aware of it when it seeped out of rocks, or, as happened here, in Oil Creek in Titusville in Pennsylvania, when it contaminated the streams. Some of its properties had been put to use from the very earliest times. The Egyptians had used bitumen for embalming the dead 5,000 years BC. And the bricks in the walls of Jericho and Babylon, it's been found, were bonded together with a bituminous mortar. And if we reach back to the flood, it might be said that the survival of life on Earth depended upon it, if we presume that Noah, when he built the ark, used pitch to caulk its seams. The Chinese have a claim to making the first use of oil in an industrial enterprise, Chinese workers drilling for brine struck oil and gas in the times of Confucius, before 600 BC. And they ran the gas off through bamboo pipes and burnt it to illuminate the salt mines. Edwin Drake was the first to drill for the unknown source of it. Drake hired the local blacksmith to sink a hole near Titusville in Pennsylvania, and they housed the rig inside the shed in the background. This reconstruction of Drake's well has been put up on the very spot where, on a hot day, August the 28th, 1859, his enterprise was rewarded. It produced only 10 barrels a day, but it was the first commercial oil well in history. When the news of Drake's oil strike spread, others began to put down drills around Titusville, and soon there were pumps everywhere. And so began yet another hectic American adventure, as oil hunters rushed to Pennsylvania in thousands. The most astonishing boom town was called Pithole. Oil was found there in January 1865. Within 8 months, a complete town had materialized with 50 hotels, 2 banks, 2 churches, piped water, and more than 15,000 inhabitants. Its decline was even more precipitous. Wells ran dry, and departures soon outnumbered arrivals. By January 1866, within a single year, Pithole was deserted. This is what it's like today. But it wasn't until Edwin Drake's well, as the American industrial surge gained momentum in the 19th century, that petroleum began its metamorphosis into that most versatile and convenient form of energy that we've known so far. Not until that time had it been wondered whether oil might be distilled to light lamps, and so initiate all those developments which have led to it becoming the lifeblood of the world's economy. Only with this well, the first commercial oil well in the world, did that acupuncture begin on all the continents which tapped the black underground oceans. Those deep down seas of convertible power which have made possible the proliferating numbers of cars and planes and home fires in our own time. As the last century was drawing to a close, the American democracy seemed agreed within itself upon a set of powerfully simplified objectives. The most highly prized of them was self-enrichment through commerce. And to achieve it, rich and poor alike were willing to work together. By this time, the Americans had erected a whole pantheon of heroes of material growth. Ruthlessly efficient, self-made men of commerce to emulate or to envy, the creators of wealth, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, and the Carnegies. By contrast, in England, the country which led the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't until 1886 that the first businessman of this proliferating middle class was made a peer thus bestowing public recognition and status. By then, there were 4,000 millionaires in the United States. By the 1890s, the Americans were poised to write a crucial chapter for our own time. There was capital waiting by the billions for investment. There was by then a huge single internal market, a continent-wide, with no petty barriers or restrictions to trade. A swelling tide of talented immigrants assured continued dedication to the quest for the good life and material possessions. There was a spectacular new source of energy, oil, and what seemed to be boundless deposits of iron and copper. Armed like this, the Americans suddenly embarked upon a vast achievement of applied technology, which oozed out all over the Atlas, and to which they brought their irrepressible imagination to transform almost beyond recognition the way we live our lives. And at the heart of that period of revolutionary innovation lay their underlying will to democratize their ideas. In the energetic passions of practical men was a belief that they were taking the mass of other Americans into partnership with them in the huge enterprise of making money and life easier. Among the most remarkable of those Americans was a man responsible for a single development. He was born in this house, the creator of the poor man's chariot, Henry Ford. Henry Ford came from a Michigan farm. At 16, he left it for the city of Detroit, apprenticed as an engineer. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the state of the art in engineering in both America and Europe was trying to translate the collective expression of transport, like trains, into mechanical means of getting about for the individual. By 1896, Ford had built his first horseless carriage. It was powered by a small gasoline engine that he had made himself. This was the genesis of his personal objective: to make this new mobility available to every man. It was to take Ford another 13 years and a succession of steadily improving models to bring out what became perhaps the most famous motor car ever built. This is the famous Model T Ford of 1909. The tin Lizzie of imperishable memory, the divinity which has shaped all our ends and which remade the face of America. It gave to the common man an unprecedented chance to roam about quickly and easily at will. Henry Ford did not invent either the assembly line or the first motor car, but his adaptations of both created industries linked to the fortunes of the car, which have come to dominate the economies and measure the well-being of nations. The Model T arrived at a time when other means of transport, wagons and coaches, were still being made of wood and by hand. Ford was the first to grasp the possibilities of mass-produced assemblies of metal parts. And metal could be cast, forged, machined or pressed into any pattern. Henry Ford also brought the same innovative enthusiasm to the molding of the men who worked for him. Ford it was who in 1914 introduced the 8-hour day and a guaranteed wage, which was twice the rate elsewhere. Henry Ford had pioneered an initiative which put huge spending power in the hands of the workers. Ford's insight was to see that modern technology could only be applied successfully if a given task was broken down into many component parts. The man who puts in the bolt doesn't put on the nut. The man who puts on the nut doesn't tighten it, he said. In that crisp injunction, Henry Ford summed up the assembly line and mass production. With that division of labor, the 5,000 parts of the Model T Ford could be assembled 8 times faster than they had been before. Output shot up. Within 5 years, he was able to bring the price of it down by almost 50%. It sold for as little as $300. The men who built it could afford to buy it. Whereas in most of previous history, the productivity of labor had been so low that the benefits of leisure and of luxury belonged only to the privileged. In 1913, the year the assembly line was installed, Ford was making 1,000 cars a day. Altogether, he turned out 15 million Model Ts. In any color the customer wanted, he said, as long as it's black. The Model T was the subject of more jokes, stories, controversy, and affection than any other car in history. When the last model rolled off the assembly line in 1927, it had rattled its way to the farthest corners of the world, and many are still going. Henry Ford was a remorseless collector of the gadgets and machines from his own enormously innovative period of American history, which he embalmed for us in his museum in Detroit. This great spawning of devices designed to alleviate effort and burden and to emancipate themselves and their fellow men constituted the crucial objective of the American culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. It is to the Americans that the world owes its liberation above all from ancient drudgeries. It was in this modest brick building, with a workshop behind it, that Wilbur and Orville Wright not only made and sold bicycles, but worked towards one of man's most elusive aspirations. The enormous stream of discoveries and innovations which marked the 19th and 20th centuries were due less to uniquely more enlightened powers of reason or imagination than to the development of better tools and instruments. It was the Wright brothers alone who, in this cycle workshop, hit upon the practical fulfillment of an ages-old seductive aspiration, sustained flight. And to do that, they had to invent another American prototype, the wind tunnel. By blowing air through this wooden box with a fan, they were able to watch the behavior of wings and tails in simulated flight. They designed a solution for what had always been an elusive mystery, how to maintain stability and control in 3 dimensions. And they went on to demonstrate that they could both fly and steer in the Earth's atmosphere. That first halting flight was one of the greatest stumbles of history. It changed, after all, the conduct of both war and peace. It seems less of a surprise, but almost inevitable, that what the Wright brothers were the first to pioneer successfully from this workshop, and which was taken up so urgently by hosts of others, would point ultimately to the domain which knows no boundaries, and which the Americans would embrace as the final frontier.
Metals from the Earth, in all their history, had been earthbound. It would need a brilliant new age of alchemy to make them fly.
I'm Robert Raymond, and I'm the producer of this series. Anyone who's watched this episode, which outlines the ideas and the resources which enable the United States to become the world's most influential industrial power, must wonder what's gone wrong over the last 2 or 3 decades. With smokestack industries like steel fighting a rearguard action against foreign competition, with pioneering achievements like the electronic chip in danger of being overtaken, and most devastating of all, that quintessential American artifact, the automobile, under hot pursuit from imports, it might seem that the golden age of American technological leadership is over. One place where that argument is not wholly accepted is the Graduate School of Business Administration at Harvard University in Boston. Kim Clark, an associate professor here, is co-author of the book Industrial Renaissance, Producing a Competitive Future for America. In this book, the challenge to American manufacturing is clearly set out.
The problem in American industry, and I think it's typified by the auto industry, is very simple. I think we went to sleep somewhere in the 1950s. We used to have an industrial system, particularly in the auto industry, that was progressive, aggressive, powerful, the envy of the world. And I think we were very successful. And part of the problem was our success created the idea that we were going to be successful forever. And the industry got preoccupied, auto industry, other industries in this country got preoccupied with things apart from the basic technology, the basic production systems that had made it powerful. The things that were important were marketing, styling considerations, and above all else, volume. Now, the industry had always been focused on volume, on a mass market, but in the early years, it also had a focus on technology, on advancing the state of the product. When we went to sleep in the 50s, the volume took over and began to drive the business. And as a result, a lot of the things that today are critical, quality, innovation, commitment to excellence, those things took a backseat to volume. And our production systems, particularly in the auto industry, came to focus increasingly on meeting the shipment schedule in the factory. And that meant piling inventories into the system. That meant reducing the quality of the product. That meant holding down innovation in order to not disrupt the factory. And everything was sacrificed for volume. And that really led to a lot of bad habits and bad characteristics in the plants. And we see them in the evidence of the success of competitors who came in and attacked us directly on the things that we got bad in: quality, innovation, meeting the needs of the customer. The other thing that happened, which was a bad result, again springing from our success, was pride, was the arrogance of a management group that had literally overwhelmed the world and assumed that because they had achieved the dominant position, they were going to stay there forever. And that led them to overlook the potential dangers that were lurking on the horizon when the smaller competitors began to compete on quality and on innovation. And over a period of time, that led to a situation where one day they woke up and discovered that 10%, 15%, 20% of their market was going to people competing on very different terms, completely different approach to the business. And that really, I think, was a direct result of these kind of going to sleep back in the 50s.
Well, now having woken up,
yeah,
what can they do about it?
Well, that's the exciting part. That's the exciting part. Americans are by nature quick to respond to the emergency. And the big problem for the auto companies in the last few years has been to convince themselves and the people who work for them that there's an emergency and that they need to change. The things that have to change are very clear. We have to produce a higher quality product. We have to introduce much different technology than we've introduced before. And that infusion of new customer demands and new technology is having a transforming influence on the industry. It is remarkable for anyone who was familiar with auto companies in the late 50s and early 60s to walk into a modern U.S. auto company today. Unbelievable transformation taking place in the very essence of the product and the business. Now, you're talking about companies that are so big that they boggle the mind, okay? And that means that it's like the big ocean liner turning around. It takes time, but the change that's taking place is significant. I think it's being driven by technology and by the demands of the marketplace. What we're finding is that our old management practices don't fit. And therefore, as the technology shifts, as the requirements of the market shift, the firms are searching for new approaches to managing manufacturing, technology, marketing, all of the various functions of the business. And that is happening. Specifically, there is a drastic reduction ongoing in overhead staffs. One of my colleagues calls it staff infection. We were kind of hit with staff infection as we plied bureaucracy on bureaucracy. That is coming out. We're shortening the lines between the direct workforce and the heads of the companies. We're seeing people introducing participation by the line organization in the basic, functions of the business. And that, I think, is really a very powerful kind of kind of influence on the companies. The American firms are on a path, much like what the Japanese firms have traveled, which means the Japanese firms are ahead of them to some extent in some areas. The U.S. firms are starting to pick up and be equals to the Japanese in many other areas. But I think the big frontier is in this design to manufacturing linkage.
But overall, then, you're confident that American industry can hold its own in the Pacific century, which we're told is coming up?
I think there's no doubt that the U.S. firms have the ability to hold their own and even win some of them, if you will, in the Pacific century. By the way, I agree with you on the Pacific century. I think it's very definitely that way. The U.S. firms have a lot of strengths, and I think they're up to the challenge.
Out of the Fiery Furnace is brought to you by a company that makes aluminum for transportation, construction, and manufacturers of consumer products all around your house. Commonwealth Aluminum.
The companion book, Out of the Fiery Furnace, by Robert Raymond, is published by the Penn State Press and is available at bookstores throughout the country.